This is Democracy Here. My name is Doug Selwyn, and for the next two programs, we'll be looking at the issue of high-stakes testing and the significant impact it has had on our children and on public education. This investigation is a part of the ongoing work of the Education Task Force of Franklin County Continuing the Political Revolution.
Good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? My mother is a feminist and she taught me to see. Until we all have justice, not one of us is free.
Many of us who went to public school before 2002 took standardized tests such as the ITBS and the CAT. They were stressful for some and boring for most, but they did not really affect the rest of the school year, and there were no consequences that we were aware of, so they were no big deal. I felt the same way about them as a teacher. Annoying, worthless, but something to get through and then get back to real teaching and learning. But everything changed in 2002 when Congress passed No Child Left Behind, which brought high-stakes testing to public education. Suddenly, the only thing that anyone cared about, the only thing that counted, was whether students could pass tests in ELA and math given at the end of the school year. It fundamentally changed public education, and those changes continue to this day. For a policy that has had a profound impact on every public school across the country, there's remarkably little understanding of what high-stakes testing is and what its real impact has been on children, on public schools, and on our democracy. Democracy Here is going to look at high-stakes testing in our next two programs with the intention of learning more about what it is, how it's different from what many of us remember from our schooling, and why there is such serious concern about it. We will also talk about how the public can get more involved in reclaiming our schools for our children. We're very fortunate to have four guests with us to help us come to a greater understanding of high-stakes testing. Barbara Madeloni is president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. Monty Neill is executive director of FairTest. And Pixie Holbrook and Meg Robbins are veteran educators who have been dealing with testing issues for a very, very long time. So thank you all for being here. Let's start maybe with you, Monty, saying what does FairTest do? A little bit about what FairTest is as an organization.
Well, we're a national organization, 30 years old, plus more than 30, that came into being because even 30 years ago, before No Child Left Behind or the MCAS, tests were already being overused and misused for college entrance. IQ tests were sorting kids into various programs. The achievement tests you mentioned, the Iowa, the CAT, they were used sometimes to track students. It was a lot less testing and a lot lower stakes for the most part for most children. But we still were concerned and involved in the issue. And early reports we did were talking about the harmful consequences on curriculum and instruction. Unfortunately, our early efforts in the 1990s, late 80s and 90s to end the testing didn't work. There was a sort of flowering of other methods of assessment rooted in classrooms that weren't intended to be high stakes and that weren't multiple choice, that really could use a whole range of teacher evaluation of kids to gather evidence and help the teaching and learning process. That was really killed by No Child Left Behind, which was passed. But even before that in Massachusetts, a decision had been made to have a high-stakes high school graduation test based on the first MCAS, which was basically multiple choice. So we're a national group, but we've also done a lot of work in Massachusetts.
Okay. And I guess I want to start with both of you in terms of asking, when we're talking about high-stakes test, what does it mean to have a high-stakes test? What makes a test high stakes?
What makes a test high stakes is that the ramifications of the score impact the child, the educator, or the school, or the district. So there are consequences relative to the score that a child gets. As Monty points out, the graduation test for the MCAS. For teachers, the test scores of their students can be folded into their evaluation. process, and test scores are used to evaluate schools and districts and to compare schools and districts to each other, which have significant consequences relative to the ability for school districts and elected school committees to even control their public schools.
Schools can be taken over, as they have been by the state, and whole districts, such as Holyoke and Lawrence, Southbridge, have been taken over by the state, essentially because they have low standardized test scores.
Okay. I'm struck with the transition from non-high stakes to high stakes, and wondering what precipitated that move. What were the arguments that were being put forth that said what we're doing is not good enough, and we need high-stakes testing? So, and I guess this is for any of you, but how did that...
You know, if we look at the 1980s, southern states, which had, by all indicators, lousy education systems for most of the students, the governors of many of those states said, we want to put more money into the schools and improve them. And they struck a deal with business to agree that business would back increased taxes that would fund schools on condition they would have some kind of evidence that this was actually working, that somehow schools were getting better, and they picked standardized tests. And so the first really high stakes one of that nature was in Florida. There was a federal lawsuit over it, and essentially the judge said, in that case, you can't use them until the state has been legally desegregated, even if it wasn't in practice. And then you could have these high stakes graduation tests. And so it spread primarily through the South, states with heavily black populations. It spread into the North a bit, to a number of states. It spread to the Southwest with heavily Latino. And so if you look at the map, the Midwestern states with very low black and Latino populations have never had graduation tests. And mostly it's been states with heavily black or Latino populations. Massachusetts is actually a bit of an outlier on that, in that it is still an overwhelmingly white state, which is why it scores so well. Not because they're white, but because they're relatively affluent and well-paid and well-educated. It's the best educated state in the country. So it produces high test scores, and you don't have many people who are less educated relative to the rest of the country. At any rate, this is the high stakes, and it's spread on the grounds that somehow it would lead to an improvement of schools. I'll end this statement by saying that all the evidence is it failed. All the evidence is that high stakes graduation tests do not improve kids' outcomes in terms of college or employment. It leads to dropout rates, it leads to higher prison rates, it leads to more broken families, all the causes of dropping out. It has not improved schools according to national and international data. It just has failed. It has not closed the so-called achievement gap, which is whites tend to score higher than blacks and Latinos. That has not changed in Massachusetts since they started the MCAS.
Okay.
But I also think it's important to understand that the test has been weaponized. We're at a moment in history for the past 30 or 40 years where there's been a concerted effort by the right wing to prove that the public good, that the public sector cannot do its work, to undermine the public sector. And they do that in a variety of ways. We have a really good example a few years ago in Boston, when we had all of those snowstorms. We had been underfunding the transit system in Boston for years, and then the snowstorms came and the underfunding was exposed. But the message was not that we had been underfunding mass transit, but that the public sector can't do its job and we need to privatize. Tests have been used exactly the same way in Massachusetts and across the country. So it's an effort to devalue public education in order to undermine the public good and to undermine the unionized workers who serve us in the public sector.
Okay. I want to turn to the teachers on the panel at this point, and Pixie and Meg. You are both veteran teachers, so you lived through the transition.
Indeed.
Right?
Yeah.
You both taught before the test became high stakes test and after. So could you talk a little bit about how things changed once high stakes came in? What you
Do you want to do regular ed first?
Sure. I taught middle and high school students, and I was lucky enough to come in at a time when actually, there's no curriculum at all. And it definitely needed changing. I remember walking into classrooms where the books were older than me. I taught social studies and humanities, but it was also at the beginning of an age where, especially in middle school, teachers were being allowed to work collaboratively together in teams and really create pretty outstanding, very engaging curriculum. And the focus was really sitting down together, because there was no state mandate, and often there was no district mandate, about what it was kids should know at the end of the year. For middle school, it's always getting them ready for high school. And we were able to kind of bring that back and say, forget high school. Let's really talk about what kids need to be engaged and active learners and thinkers by the time they leave 8th grade. And it was incredibly hard work. It was really engaging for the kids. It was engaging for us. I think we were really sort of on the brink of something terrific. And I actually, looking back, in 1982 in Massachusetts was, I think, that when Proposition 2.5 went through. And I can remember being in my high school classroom at that time, and it meant the first thing that happens when there's no money in public funds is teachers go. And I think 15% of the school got pink slips in one afternoon. And the principal went through the corridors coming into our classrooms while we were teaching second or last period classes and called us out in the corridor and gave us our pink slips and then said, you know, thanks for all the hard work. And then we had to go in and teach the last 2 classes. And because we're teachers, we did it, and we did a really good job of it. But morale for a lot of people went out the window at that time. And I remember a lot of my friends moved away. A whole segment of young teachers left Massachusetts. They went to Washington State, they went to California, they went to New York, they went somewhere where they thought it would be less hostile. The bad thing about having no curriculum is that I might be teaching very actively in my classroom, and I might have my standards for what needs to happen, but the guy across the hall might be doing baseball scores. And there definitely was a need for there to be a conversation about what is it kids need to know and be able to do when they leave different grade levels, and how do we build on that scaffolded learning from pre-K through 12. And those are really important, terrific conversations. And actually, when Massachusetts started looking at thinking about standards for learning, one of the really exciting things that happened for us as teachers was that we were invited to be part of creating. They weren't standards, they were guidelines, I think was the word that we used at that time. And I can remember working with teachers from across the state on creating the social studies guidelines, and they were really good. They were active, they were interesting, there were little vignettes about what it would look like when we were teaching them, and it was a really great sharing time. And we submitted them to the state, and they threw them out the window, right? And John Silber was in charge of the education department at that time, and they came in with something written by BU professors instead, which was huge, absolutely gigantic. And that came suddenly, and we were handed those, and we were told to teach something that was really broad, really wide, had a lot of details in it, and you better cover the whole thing because something in there was going to get tested. And you didn't actually know what it was going to be. Maybe you hit bingo on that thing, you went deep in, and maybe you wouldn't when it got to the breadth. And that was a real turning point for us.
Okay. And Pixie, for you?
Yeah, I'm advocating here for my students with special needs, and it's a very big, broad range of types of students. So just to cover children with physical difficulties, children with cognitive difficulties, children with a specific learning disability, by definition, average to above average, but have struggled learning to read, write, and do math. Students on the autism spectrum, which is manifests in anxiety, inflexibility, poor social relationships, and then our students with severe emotional and behavioral problems, usually from trauma and or neglect. That's a big range. Yes. But the IEP, the Individual Educational Plan, protects those kids. And so I had to take that situation, which was challenging enough for us to figure out ways for these children to learn, but now you're expecting a test, a one-size-fits-all test, to be taken by students with this level of disability and difference, learning difference. So initially, there were several of us that were called to the State House as advocates for students with disabilities to say, don't you think we should waive this, you know, for children with special needs? And we said, oh no. Parents and professionals worked so long, so hard to get equal access. You are not going to cast them off, and huge setback for all the work that had been done. So we stayed firm. We said, no, no, you are not waiving it. So then the next step would be to create a set of accommodations. So now, as we did then, and now they're getting tweaked over the time, we can give the test under different situations, smaller class group, one-to-one, they can have a spell checker, a calculator, but the bottom line is they take the exact same test. The most severe children, more with the cognitive delays, they have an alternative assessment, which is more like a portfolio that the teachers gather data throughout the year. So they're not subjected to this. But all those other students must take the identical test. So it's been alarming when it first happened. It's equally alarming now. It is not any better. It uses up an inordinate number of staff people to do all these specialized accommodations. In the IEP also, many of our children have something called modified curriculum. So it makes, the teacher has to take a look at what are the salient points of whatever you're studying. And let's limit our kids to those salient points. Again, can't do that with the MCAS. It's the exact same experience for these kids.
And when you're using all those extra staff to help with the testing, does that mean that some people are not getting the services during testing?
So the loss of services is profound. They are prepping, they are practicing, and then they're administrating. So not only are the students being taken away from these guaranteed, by the IEP, guaranteed services, but all the staff that would have served them are busy giving this test to children all over the building. It's incredibly disruptive to their schedule. These kids are not only losing their services, but they expect something regular. They expect something familiar. It's a scary day, and they expect the teachers to take care of them and protect them. And all of a sudden, there's a whole new world for, it's close to a full week for each one of these tests when you come to it. And that's very disturbing. It's an untimed test for everyone, but many of our kids process language slower. Again, I'm not talking about English as a second language, but children who process language slower, express themselves slower. This can take hours way beyond the regular ed student too, so it's highly disruptive.
And emotionally, I would think it's difficult for at least some of your students.
The anxiety is terrific. We end up having to hold their hands through the rest of the day. It really disturbs the whole day. We try to squeeze in extra recesses. We've been known to feed them and give them drinks, and the day is done for these kids. And it's a very disturbing week. Barbara, did you want to add something?
I mean, a couple of things. I was so interested, as you were saying, you know, when the standardized high-stakes tests were introduced, that advocates for children with special learning needs sort of wanted the same standard applied because of the anxiety about there being different standards, and that meaning then that students weren't getting what they needed. Right. But what's so striking about that is, like, what if it's the wrong thing that's being applied? Right. And from what Meg was saying, we know it was the wrong thing. Like, we didn't say what we need to do is make sure that every child has equal access to a classroom that's the right size for who they are and their special needs, that the educator has the opportunity to access the resources that she needs in order to meet the variety of needs of these students. We didn't say that we're going to make sure that educators' professional knowledge and expertise is valued and brought into the curriculum and into the classroom. We said we're going to have one standardized test, and we're going to judge people based on that. So the idea of sort of equal access got so distorted at that moment, rather than equal access to meaningful, high-quality education for every child.
And what we learned was that kids who do well on tests did really well.
We knew that.
That was it.
And we know that there's the highest correlation, as Monty has indicated, between test scores is the socioeconomic status and education status of the family the child grew up in. So we're taking young people who are already entering the classroom in a society that has told them they're less than adequate, and we're proving to them and their educators that they're less than adequate. You know, I would say the impact on young people is much more than a really bad day or a bad week. It really sends a message about who they are and what they're capable of. And as a high school English teacher, you know, my job was to discover the possibility in every child so that she could begin to know what she was capable of that maybe she couldn't see herself. And the tests say, no, this is going to determine your value. And it's devastating for young people.
I want to add that it's particularly also awful for English language learners.
Indeed.
The two groups of students who fail to pass the MCAS at the highest rates are English language learners and students with disabilities. And so they are denied diplomas. And of course, the absurdity of it is you're taking kids who don't know English, giving them a test in English, and then you're surprised they don't do well. I mean, if they gave me a test in Turkish, I would not do very well at this. And even if you give me 2 years, you have to take the test after 1 year under federal law. If you gave me 2 years, I wouldn't know Turkish, I can guarantee it. So, 5 and 7 years, I might be functional. Whether I could do academics, well, that is literally what the research says, 7 years. On average.
And also historically, and I can't remember exactly what year it was after 2000, it might have been 2001 or 2, there was a state determination that aides in schools needed to be bilingual. And at least out here, there were a lot of Spanish-speaking aides who worked in really predominantly Latino schools, who kids really relied on for that assistance and that support. And by then I was working as an educational coach in schools, and I worked a lot in Holyoke, and I can remember these aides having to take this test over the telephone about whether they were fluent in English, and they failed. They would fail in a 5-minute interview over telephone, and then they disappeared the next day. And the kids' support for having somebody help them translate what was happening was out the window, and teachers were told to say when kids spoke Spanish in the classroom, English only, English only. And it was policing, really, what was happening. In
that law was on the books for quite a while and has only now been ended. And districts can now choose an English-only process or, other variations where, in fact, some of the learning can be in the native language, like Spanish. Absolutely.
So those kids failed. And I can remember seeing them when they should have gone on to high school, and they were hanging out in the playground outside the middle schools, waiting for their friends to get out of school and come through. That was it for them. That was it. They're gone.
And no one was measuring the dropout rate. I can remember early on there was a conversation about all of a sudden our students are doing remarkably well, but so many had dropped out that group rose to the top. Another thing we often would say in groups and rallies was, we already know which children are going to fail. We know why they fail. Just look at the zip code. Get rid of the test, just look at the zip code. Look at the zip code, that's where we get the smallest class sizes, the finest teachers, the best wraparound information, the best wraparound resources, enrichment, parent education. We already know.
I'm actually going to have to jump in on you saying the finest teachers. I think we have amazing teachers across the state. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge the work that educators do is a different kind of a work when young people are entering their classrooms traumatized by economic and racial injustice. And they're bringing that into the classroom, and our educators have to be attentive to a wide variety of needs that they have. And then the test actually is keeping them from doing the work that they should and can do relative to culturally responsive teaching, ethnic studies, really teaching young people to speak back to the world that they're given. So what the testing says is you have to take the world that it's given, and we're going to judge you based on this standardization, when in fact for these young people they need to learn how to access their critical thinking about the power structures. That's where we see students be most successful, who are coming and experiencing deeply the economic and racial injustice of our society.
And the other thing that happened, of course, with the loss of funding and with the advent of testing was that what got tested was what got attention. So the kids who didn't do well lost the arts, they lost recess. I mean, who takes recess away from kids? They lost anything that might have actually engaged them in school, or that could have been used to sort of engage them in larger learning. And if it wasn't going to be tested, it didn't get any funding. And I taught social studies, and I'm not saying that it should ever be tested in that way, but I must say that we never, once testing came in, it was ELA and math. They tried testing history for a little while, and it didn't work. That was it. I mean, no one wanted to really hear from teachers who didn't teach what were really what called core subjects anymore.
So you saw two things. One is cutting back the curriculum to the tested subjects, which essentially is English language and math. Science is tested in a few grades, but there weren't stakes attached to it, so it didn't really matter. What mattered was English language, arts, and math. So yes, ending recess, my grandkids in a middle-class suburbs were given every day there was a class period devoted to practicing for the MCAS, even though they actually tested well. They didn't need it, but even in the suburbs, it was this fear. And so it had the same effect, only it was worse if your scores were likely to be low because you had a lot of poor kids, a lot of immigrants, and so on. The other thing that happened that we hear constantly from all over the country, not just Massachusetts, is in English language arts and math, the test becomes the curriculum. That what happens is an enormous pressure for the teachers to focus on what's on the test and to teach in ways that they think are likely to improve test scores. So that means a lot of memorization without critical thought, a lot of regurgitation, because that's what the tests are measuring, with recall and rote application. And they keep telling us the new generation of tests will do higher order thinking. And they're telling us that about MCAS too, and it's still not true.
And the other part is whether or not kids can actually read the directions in the test, which are often very confusing. The language that are put in there to ask for the same answer is a whole sort of mess of the one word that means the same thing, but it's a different word, especially in math problems. And I remember in the early days, it's still an issue that I find amazing now, is that the tests are actually created to confuse kids. So it may say, put your answer in part A, and here's part B, and here's part C, and it's really different, and it goes through that. And they lose kids right there. And the number of kids who just put their pencils down and put their heads down and just say, I don't even begin to understand it. I can remember getting, we could only read the tests when we administered them. In the middle school, we gave all the tests. So we gave every single one of them. It didn't go to content teachers to do it. We had our core group of kids and we gave them. And it would say on the tests, read only what is in bold. And it would say, read now. And we had administrators whose job it was to go around and open the door and look at us while we were giving the test. And I can remember getting absolutely reamed and actually written up for it because I said something in addition. And I didn't say, read now, here's the direction for what needed to do. I was looking at a kid in the corner and said, this is something you need to listen to now.
So we're just getting started, but this is actually, we're out of time for this first half hour look at high stakes testing. We will have a second show following this to go into more detail about the impact that high stakes testing is having on our children and on our public schools. I want to thank Barbara Madeloni and Monty Neill, Pixie Holbrook and Meg Robbins for joining us today to get us started in a look at the impact of high stakes testing, and invite you to join us for the next show of Democracy Here. And for Democracy Here, I'm Doug Selwyn for Franklin County, continuing the political revolution.
Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? I don't need those corporations sucking on my tit. A little socialism don't scare me one bit. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Come all you northern liberals, taking Klansmen out to dine. The time has come to choose a side and join the picket line. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? My father was a carpenter, now he's with the air and sun. But he'll be with his fellow workers till the battle's won. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? They say in Milwaukee, cleansed by Great Lake water, you'll either be a Union man or a thug for Scott Walker. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my